Doctor humiliates black nurse in front of patient, unaware of who the patient really is. The fluorescent lights of the Harmony Medical Clinic hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the daily rhythm of hurried footsteps, hushed conversations, and the beeping of medical equipment. Dr. Thomas Ashton, a man whose crisp white coat seemed to amplify his already imposing stature, strode through the bustling waiting room. His face, etched with the lines of years spent in demanding service, was set in a professional, yet somewhat impatient expression. He was running behind schedule, and the overflowing waiting room was a testament to his popularity, or perhaps the lack of other options in this part of rural Pennsylvania. Behind the reception desk, Sarah Jenkins, a black woman with a warm smile that could melt the iciest of hearts, efficiently juggled phone calls, patient charts, and the occasional frantic request from a frazzled parent. Sarah had been with the clinic for over 15 years, her calm demeanor and genuine compassion a soothing balm to anxious patients. She knew most of them by name, their families, and even their pets. Today, however, the usual hum of the clinic felt different. An undercurrent of tension seemed to weave its way through the air, clinging to the sterile scent of antiseptic. Dr. Ashton, known for his gruff bedside manner, had been particularly short-tempered this morning. And a new patient, Mr. Elijah Vance, was proving to be challenging. Mr. Vance, an elderly gentleman with a distinguished air and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of stories, sat quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the distance. He'd arrived precisely on time for his appointment, a rarity in this clinic, and politely declined Sarah's offer of a magazine. There was an aura of quiet dignity about him, an air of someone accustomed to being listened to. Dr. Ashton, after a quick consultation with a young intern, emerged from an examination room, his brow furrowed. He glanced at the waiting room, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing on Sarah. "Jenkins," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "Mr. Vance's paperwork isn't in order. I need his insurance verification and medical history, stat." Sarah, without missing a beat, calmly replied, "I've already requested those, Dr. Ashton. The insurance company is being slow, as usual, and Mr. Vance informed me he'd prefer to give his medical history directly to you." Dr. Ashton sighed, a puff of exasperation. "Well, he'll have to wait. I can't see a patient without the proper documentation. It's clinic policy." He turned to walk back into an examination room, then paused, glancing back at Sarah. "And Jenkins," he added, his voice dropping slightly, tried to keep things moving. "We're already running behind." Sarah nodded, her smile tightening slightly. She understood the pressure Dr. Ashton was under, but his tone, the subtle undercurrent of impatience, grated on her nerves. It wasn't the first time he'd spoken to her in such a way, especially when he was stressed. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that her job was to care for the patients, not to engage in workplace politics. As Dr. Ashton disappeared into the examination room, Sarah's phone rang. It was the insurance company, finally with Mr. Vance's verification. She quickly gathered the necessary information and walked towards the examination room where Dr. Ashton was seeing another patient. She knocked lightly and entered. Inside, Dr. Ashton was listening to a patient's heartbeat, his expression focused. He waved Sarah to the side, indicating she should wait. Sarah stood quietly, holding the paperwork. The patient, a middle-aged woman with a nervous smile, glanced at Sarah curiously. When Dr. Ashton finished his examination, he turned to Sarah, his hand outstretched. Sarah handed him the paperwork. As he reviewed it, his eyes widened slightly. He looked up at Sarah, a flicker of surprise in his gaze. He then looked towards Mr. Vance's file, which Sarah had placed on the corner of his desk. He picked it up, his expression shifting from surprise to something akin to apprehension. Dr. Ashton stared at the file in his hands, the name Elijah Vance suddenly seeming to loom larger than the letters printed on the crisp white label. He flipped open the file, his eyes scanning the neatly typed medical history. His breath hitched slightly as he read the first line, "Veteran, U.S. Army, Distinguished Service Cross recipient." He continued reading, his gaze moving over the list of commendations, awards, and citations. Each one was a testament to a life of service, bravery, and sacrifice. He glanced back at Mr. Vance's file, then at Sarah, a strange mix of confusion and dawning realization washing over him. He remembered now. He remembered the stories his grandfather, a retired army doctor, used to tell about a young black soldier who had saved his life during the Korean War, a soldier named Elijah Vance. Dr. Ashton's grandfather had passed away several years ago, but his stories, vivid and filled with admiration for this brave soldier, had stayed with Dr. Ashton. He had even tried to find Mr. Vance once, but with no luck. And now, here he was, sitting in his waiting room. He cleared his throat, a sudden wave of embarrassment washing over him. He had been so quick to judge, so focused on the paperwork, that he had completely overlooked the man sitting before him. He had treated him like just another patient, another name on a chart, without any regard for his history, his dignity. He closed the file, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Sarah, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing look. He couldn't meet her eyes. He knew she had heard him earlier, his impatient tone, his dismissive words. He wondered if she knew who Mr. Vance was. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He had to make amends. He had to apologize. Not just to Mr. Vance, but to Sarah as well. He had been disrespectful to both of them, blinded by his own prejudices and assumptions. He walked out of the examination room, his steps heavier than usual. He approached Mr. Vance, who was still sitting quietly in the corner, his gaze fixed on the same unseen point in the distance. Dr. Ashton cleared his throat again, trying to find the right words. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice sounding strangely hoarse. "I apologize for the delay. There was a slight issue with your paperwork, but everything is in order now. Please, come with me." Mr. Vance looked up, his eyes meeting Dr. Ashton's. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment, just a quiet understanding. He nodded slowly and stood up, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his age. As they walked towards the examination room, Dr. Ashton glanced back at Sarah. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. He knew he had a long way to go to make up for his mistakes, but he was determined to try. He owed it to Mr. Vance, to Sarah, and to himself. He owed it to the memory of his grandfather, who had taught him the importance of respect, compassion, and the true meaning of service. Inside the examination room, Dr. Ashton gestured for Mr. Vance to sit down. He pulled up a chair opposite him, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like a nervous medical student facing his first patient, rather than a seasoned doctor with years of experience. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice still a little shaky, "I want to apologize again for the delay and for any inconvenience you may have experienced. I also want to thank you for your patience and understanding." Mr. Vance nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Dr. Ashton. "There's no need for apologies, doctor. I understand things happen." Dr. Ashton took a deep breath. "Mr. Vance," he said, I was reviewing your file, and I couldn't help but notice your service record. Your distinguished service in the Korean War. I was deeply honored to see it." A flicker of something, pride perhaps, or a hint of sadness, crossed Mr. Vance's face. He looked down at his hands, which were clasped tightly in his lap. "Thank you, doctor," he said quietly. "It was a long time ago." Dr. Ashton leaned forward, his voice softening. "My grandfather, Dr. Samuel Ashton, served in the Korean War as well. He was a surgeon. He told me stories about a young black soldier who saved his life, a soldier named Elijah Vance." Mr. Vance's head snapped up, his eyes widening slightly. "Samuel Ashton," he repeated, his voice filled with surprise. "Your grandfather was Samuel Ashton." Dr. Ashton nodded. "Yes, sir. He spoke of you often. He said you were the bravest man he had ever met." A slow smile spread across Mr. Vance's face, a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. "Your grandfather was a good man, doctor," he said. "A very good man. He saved many lives, including mine." Dr. Ashton felt a lump forming in his throat. He couldn't believe it. He was sitting across from the very man his grandfather had spoken of so often, the man who had saved his life. He had treated him with impatience, with disrespect, and he hadn't even recognized him. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. I'm so honored to meet you. My grandfather would be. He would be so proud." Mr. Vance chuckled softly. "Your grandfather was always proud, doctor. He had a lot to be proud of." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy in the air. Dr. Ashton felt a profound sense of shame for his earlier behavior. He had judged Mr. Vance based on his appearance, on his name, without any regard for his history, his service, his humanity. He looked at Mr. Vance, at the lines etched on his face, the wisdom in his eyes, and he realized that he had a lot to learn. He had a lot to learn about respect, about compassion, about the importance of looking beyond the surface. "Mr. Vance," he said, I want to thank you for your service, for your bravery, and for your understanding. I promise you, I will never make the same mistake again." Mr. Vance smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I know you won't, Doctor," he said. "I can see it in your heart." The examination continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The sterile, impersonal space now felt warm, filled with a shared sense of connection. Dr. Ashton listened attentively as Mr. Vance described his current health concerns, his questions now laced with genuine interest and respect. He no longer saw Mr. Vance as just a patient, but as a man, a hero, a link to his own family history. As Dr. Ashton conducted the examination, he couldn't help but think about Sarah. He knew he needed to apologize to her, to acknowledge his disrespectful behavior. He had been so quick to judge, so blinded by his own assumptions, that he had failed to see her for who she was, a dedicated professional, a compassionate caregiver, and a woman who deserved his respect. When the examination was complete, Dr. Ashton walked Mr. Vance to the reception desk. "Sarah," he said, his voice sincere, "Mr. Vance is ready to schedule his follow-up appointment." Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Dr. Ashton's. She saw the change in his demeanor, the genuine remorse in his gaze. She smiled warmly. "Of course, Dr. Ashton," she said, and proceeded to arrange Mr. Vance's next visit. As Mr. Vance walked away, Sarah turned to Dr. Ashton. "He's a remarkable man," she said quietly. Dr. Ashton nodded. "He is," he replied. "Sarah, I want to apologize for my behavior earlier. I was wrong. I was disrespectful, and I'm truly sorry." Sarah looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Dr. Ashton," she said, "we all have moments where we fall short. What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and try to do better." Dr. Ashton sighed. "I know," he said, "but that doesn't excuse my behavior. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment. I didn't see you, Sarah. I didn't see Mr. Vance. I just saw labels." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle and reassuring. "It's okay, Dr. Ashton," she said. "We all have our own struggles. The important thing is that you're willing to acknowledge them and work through them." Dr. Ashton looked at her, gratitude filling his heart. He had been so focused on his own embarrassment, his own shame, that he hadn't realized how much he had hurt Sarah. He had taken her for granted. Assuming her silence meant acceptance, he had been wrong. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your understanding. I promise I'll do better." Sarah smiled. "I know you will, Dr. Ashton," she said. "We all have the capacity for growth, for change. It's just a matter of being willing to open our hearts and minds." From that day forward, Dr. Ashton's interactions with Sarah, and with all his patients, changed. He learned to listen more attentively, to see beyond the surface, to recognize the humanity in every individual. He learned the true meaning of respect, compassion, and the power of human connection. He learned that even the smallest act of kindness can bridge the widest divides, and that understanding begins with empathy. The change in Dr. Ashton wasn't immediate, nor was it dramatic. It was subtle, a gradual shift in his perspective, a softening of his edges. He started listening more intently to his patients, not just to their symptoms, but to their stories, their fears, their hopes. He began to see them not as cases or diagnoses, but as individuals with unique lives and experiences. He also started paying more attention to Sarah, acknowledging her contributions, appreciating her insights. He no longer saw her as just the receptionist or the nurse, but as a valuable member of the clinic team, a woman with intelligence, compassion, and a deep understanding of the community they served. One afternoon, a young mother came into the clinic with her sick child. The child was fussy and irritable, the mother exhausted and stressed. Dr. Ashton, remembering his own children's childhood illnesses, took the time to connect with the mother, offering words of comfort and reassurance. He listened patiently as she described her concerns, and he explained the child's condition in simple, easy-to-understand terms. The mother left the clinic feeling relieved and grateful, not just for the medical care, but for the genuine human connection she had experienced. She shared her experience with friends and family, and soon, word spread throughout the community about the compassionate doctor at Harmony Medical Clinic. The clinic's atmosphere began to change. The hum of tension that had once permeated the air was replaced by a sense of warmth and welcome. Patients felt heard, valued, and respected. The staff, inspired by Dr. Ashton's example, also began to interact with patients in a more caring and empathetic manner. Sarah noticed the change. She saw the genuine smiles on patients' faces, the relaxed atmosphere in the waiting room, the increased sense of community within the clinic. She knew that Dr. Ashton's transformation had sparked a ripple effect, spreading throughout the clinic and beyond. One day, Mr. Vance came in for a follow-up appointment. As he sat in the waiting room, he observed the interactions between the staff and the patients. He saw the genuine care and concern in Dr. Ashton's eyes as he spoke to a worried elderly woman. He heard the laughter of a child as Sarah playfully interacted with him while his mother filled out paperwork. After his appointment, Mr. Vance approached Dr. Ashton. "Doctor," he said, "I want to commend you. I've noticed a real difference in this clinic. It feels different, more caring." Dr. Ashton smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," he said. "It means a lot to me." Mr. Vance nodded. "You've learned a valuable lesson, doctor," he said. "A lesson that many doctors never learn. You've learned that medicine is not just about treating diseases. It's about treating people. It's about seeing them, hearing them, and understanding them." Dr. Ashton looked at Mr. Vance, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew that he still had much to learn, but he was on the right path. He was building bridges of understanding, one patient, one interaction at a time. He was making a difference, not just in the lives of his patients, but in the community as a whole. The connection between Dr. Ashton and Mr. Vance deepened over time. It wasn't just a doctor-patient relationship anymore. It was something more, something akin to a quiet, unspoken friendship. They would often talk about things unrelated to medicine, about their families, their experiences, their perspectives on life. Dr. Ashton learned about Mr. Vance's life after the war, his struggles, his triumphs, his quiet acts of service to his community. Mr. Vance, in turn, learned about Dr. Ashton's family, his passions, his hopes for the future of the clinic. One day, Dr. Ashton received a call from Sarah. Mr. Vance had been admitted to the hospital. His health had taken a turn for the worse. Dr. Ashton immediately went to the hospital. He found Mr. Vance in a private room, hooked up to various monitors and for drips. He looked frail, but his eyes still held that familiar spark of wisdom and understanding. Dr. Ashton sat by his bedside, taking his hand. "Mr. Vance," he said softly, "I'm so sorry to see you like this." Mr. Vance smiled weakly. "Don't be, doctor," he said. It's just part of life." They talked for hours that day. They talked about the past, about the present, about the future. They talked about the importance of family, the value of friendship, the power of compassion. Mr. Vance shared stories from his life, stories of courage, resilience, and quiet dignity. Dr. Ashton listened, absorbing every word, realizing he was in the presence of a truly remarkable man. As the days passed, Dr. Ashton visited Mr. Vance regularly. He would bring him books, magazines, sometimes just sit quietly by his side, holding his hand. He noticed Sarah also visited Mr. Vance. They would often share quiet smiles and small talk. There was an unspoken bond between the three of them, a connection forged through respect, understanding, and shared humanity. One evening, as Dr. Ashton was leaving the hospital, Sarah stopped him. "Dr. Ashton," she said, "Mr. Vance, he's been asking about you." Dr. Ashton nodded. "I know," he said. "I was just with him." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then spoke softly. He told me that you remind him of his son. He said you have the same kind heart." Dr. Ashton's heart swelled with emotion. He didn't know what to say. He had come to care deeply for Mr. Vance, to see him as a friend, a mentor, a source of inspiration. To know that Mr. Vance felt a similar connection to him it was deeply moving. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know." Sarah smiled. "He cares about you, Dr. Ashton," she said. "We both do," Dr. Ashton looked at Sarah, at her kind, compassionate face, and he realized how much she had become a part of his life, a part of the transformation he had undergone. He had learned so much from her quiet strength, her unwavering compassion, her deep understanding of human nature. He was grateful for her presence in his life, for her friendship, for her unwavering support. The following weeks were difficult. Mr. Vance's health continued to decline. Dr. Ashton and Sarah visited him as often as they could, offering comfort, support, and simply their presence. They would sit with him, holding his hand, sharing stories, sometimes just enjoying the quiet companionship. They both knew the time was coming, but they cherished every moment, every shared glance, every whispered word. One quiet afternoon, Dr. Ashton sat by Mr. Vance's bedside. Mr. Vance was weak, his breathing shallow, but his eyes were clear, filled with a deep sense of peace. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice raspy, I want to thank you." Dr. Ashton squeezed his hand gently. "For what, Mr. Vance?" For seeing me," he said. "For seeing beyond the surface." Dr. Ashton nodded, his heart aching. "I learned that from you, Mr. Vance," he said. "You taught me the importance of truly seeing people." Mr. Vance smiled weakly. "You were a good student," he whispered. They fell silent for a moment, the only sound the gentle beeping of the machines. "Doctor," Mr. Vance said, his voice barely audible, "I have something for you." He gestured weakly towards a small drawer beside his bed. Dr. Ashton opened it and found a worn leather-bound journal. This is my story," Mr. Vance said. "My life, my experiences. I want you to have it." Dr. Ashton took the journal, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know what to say. Just read it." Mr. Vance whispered. "And remember." A few days later, Mr. Vance passed away peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Ashton and Sarah were by his side. They held his hands until the very end, offering him their love, their gratitude, their respect. The funeral was a quiet affair, attended by Mr. Vance's family, friends, and a few members of the community whose lives he had touched. Dr. Ashton and Sarah stood together, their hearts filled with both sadness and a deep sense of gratitude for having known such a remarkable man. After the funeral, Dr. Ashton returned to the clinic. He sat in his office, the worn leather-bound journal in his hands. He opened it carefully and began to read. As he read Mr. Vance's story, Dr. Ashton was deeply moved. He learned about Mr. Vance's childhood, his struggles with poverty and prejudice, his experiences in the war, his quiet acts of service to his community. He learned about his resilience, his courage, his unwavering belief in the goodness of humanity. He also learned about Mr. Vance's son, who had passed away at a young age. Dr. Ashton understood now why Mr. Vance had said he reminded him of his son. It wasn't just about kindness, it was about something deeper, something that resonated with Mr. Vance on a profound level. As he finished reading the journal, Dr. Ashton closed his eyes and reflected on Mr. Vance's life, on his legacy of kindness, compassion, and understanding. He realized that Mr. Vance's greatest gift to him wasn't just the journal, but the lessons he had taught him, the lessons about seeing beyond the surface, about connecting with the human heart, about the true meaning of service. Dr. Ashton carried Mr. Vance's journal with him everywhere. He reread passages, reflecting on the wisdom within, the quiet strength that permeated every word. He realized that Mr. Vance's story wasn't just a personal history. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder of the power of kindness, and an inspiration for how he wanted to live his own life. He shared some of the stories with Sarah, who was equally touched by Mr. Vance's words. They talked about his legacy, about how they could honor his memory, not just through words, but through actions. They both felt a responsibility to carry forward the torch of compassion that Mr. Vance had carried so gracefully. At the clinic, Dr. Ashton continued to build upon the changes he had made. He fostered a culture of empathy and understanding, encouraging his staff to connect with patients on a deeper level. He implemented new training programs focused on communication skills, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of seeing each patient as a unique individual. He also made changes to the clinic's physical environment, creating a more welcoming and comfortable space for patients and their families. He added artwork that reflected the diversity of the community they served, and he created a quiet room where patients could reflect or pray. Sarah played a vital role in this transformation. Her natural warmth and compassion were infectious, and she became a mentor to other staff members, guiding them in developing their own empathetic approach to patient care. She also initiated community outreach programs, connecting with local organizations to provide health education and support to underserved populations. The clinic became known as a place where people felt cared for, not just medically, but emotionally and spiritually. Patients often commented on the positive atmosphere, the genuine concern of the staff, and the sense of community they felt within the clinic walls. One day, a young woman came to the clinic for a routine checkup. She was new to the area and didn't know anyone. She was nervous and a little apprehensive about seeing a new doctor. As Dr. Ashton conducted the examination, he noticed the woman's anxiety. He took the time to talk to her, not just about her physical health, but about her life, her interests, her concerns about being in a new city. The woman was surprised by his genuine interest. She had never experienced such a caring and compassionate doctor. She left the clinic feeling not just physically better, but emotionally supported. She told her friends about her experience, and soon more new patients were coming to the clinic, drawn by its reputation for compassionate care. The clinic's patient base grew, reflecting the diversity of the community, and the clinic became a true reflection of Mr. Vance's vision of inclusivity and understanding. Dr. Ashton realized that Mr. Vance's legacy was not just about the past. It was about the present and the future. It was about the ripple effect of kindness, the power of human connection, and the importance of seeing beyond the surface. It was about building a community where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. Years passed, and the Harmony Medical Clinic continued to thrive, a beacon of compassionate care in the heart of the community. Dr. Ashton, now with streaks of gray in his hair, carried Mr. Vance's journal with him still, often rereading passages for inspiration and guidance. He had become a mentor himself, sharing Mr. Vance's stories and the lessons he had learned with younger doctors and medical students. Sarah remained a pillar of strength at the clinic, her wisdom and empathy touching countless lives. She and Dr. Ashton had developed a deep, unspoken understanding, a shared commitment to carrying forward Mr. Vance's legacy. They worked together seamlessly, their different strengths complementing each other, creating a harmonious and supportive environment for both staff and patients. One day, a new family came to the clinic. The parents, a young couple, were anxious about their newborn baby, who had been experiencing some health issues. Dr. Ashton, remembering his own anxieties as a new parent, took the time to listen to their concerns, to answer their questions patiently, and to offer words of comfort and reassurance. As he examined the baby, he noticed the parents watching him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He smiled at them reassuringly. "Your baby is going to be fine," he said. "We'll take good care of him." The parents left the clinic feeling relieved and grateful. They had found not just a doctor, but a compassionate caregiver who understood their fears and anxieties. They told their friends about their experience, and soon, more young families were coming to the clinic, drawn by its reputation for compassionate care. Dr. Ashton realized that the circle of care was expanding, reaching new generations. Mr. Vance's legacy was living on, not just through him and Sarah, but through the countless lives they had touched. It was a ripple effect of kindness, spreading outwards, transforming the community, one patient, one interaction at a time. He thought about Mr. Vance, about his quiet dignity, his unwavering compassion, his profound understanding of the human heart. He realized that Mr. Vance's greatest gift to him wasn't just the journal, but the lessons he had taught him, the lessons about seeing beyond the surface, about connecting with the human spirit, about the true meaning of service. He also thought about Sarah, her unwavering support, her quiet strength, her deep empathy. He realized that she was an integral part of Mr. Vance's legacy, a partner in his mission to create a community where everyone felt seen, heard, and valued. As he looked around the clinic, at the bustling waiting room, the smiling faces of the staff, the sense of warmth and welcome that permeated the air, he knew that they were making a difference. They were building a community where kindness and compassion were not just words, but actions. A community where everyone felt a sense of belonging. Years turned into decades. Dr. Ashton, now retired, would often visit the Harmony Medical Clinic, a place that held so many memories, so much meaning. He would sit in the waiting room, observing the interactions between the staff and the patients, the warmth, the compassion, the genuine care that permeated the air. He would smile, knowing that Mr. Vance's legacy lived on. Sarah, still a vital presence at the clinic, would greet him with a warm smile, a shared understanding passing between them. They would often talk about Mr. Vance, reminiscing about his wisdom, his kindness, his profound impact on their lives. One day, a young medical student approached Dr. Ashton. "Dr. Ashton," she said, "I've heard stories about you, about your work at the clinic, about your commitment to compassionate care. I want to be like you." Dr. Ashton smiled. "That's very kind of you," he said. "But the real credit goes to a man named Elijah Vance." He told the student about Mr. Vance, about his service, his courage, his quiet dignity. He told her about the journal, about the lessons he had learned, about the importance of seeing beyond the surface, of connecting with the human heart. He showed her the journal, its worn leather cover a testament to its many readings. He pointed to a passage, a quote that Mr. Vance had written: "Kindness is not weakness, it is strength. It is the bridge that connects us to one another, the light that guides us through the darkness." The student read the passage, her eyes filled with understanding. "I understand," she said. "It's not just about treating diseases, it's about treating people." Dr. Ashton nodded. "Exactly," he said. "It's about seeing them, hearing them, understanding them. It's about recognizing their humanity, their dignity, their worth." He looked around the clinic, at the bustling waiting room, the smiling faces of the staff, the sense of warmth and welcome that permeated the air. He knew that Mr. Vance's legacy was secure. It lived on in the hearts and minds of those who worked at the clinic, in the countless lives they had touched, in the ripple effect of kindness that spread outwards, transforming the community, one patient, one interaction at a time. As he walked out of the clinic that day, Dr. Ashton felt a deep sense of peace. He had honored Mr. Vance's memory, not just through words, but through actions. He had carried forward the torch of compassion, illuminating the path for others to follow. He knew that Mr. Vance's legacy would endure, a testament to the power of kindness, the importance of human connection, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The hum of the clinic, once a sound of tension, now resonated with the harmonious melody of compassion, a lasting tribute to the man who had taught him the true meaning of medicine, the true meaning of life.